All right, why don't we start? Brian, do you mind opening us in prayer?
I do not mind. Father, we are thankful for another morning to gather. We just ask that you would be with Dom this morning, and that your truth would just flow through him to our hearts. Lord, make us receptive, our brains in tune, our hearts ready to hear what it is you would teach us this morning. So we just ask for your blessing over this time in Jesus' name.
Amen. Okay, so I have a little paragraph from Andrew Peterson's 4-volume Wing Feather Saga here. It follows these 3 kids, these 3 siblings in their adventures in this fantastical world called Here We Are. And as the first book opens, we find them living with their mother and grandfather in a little college in the land of Scree, which we have on the map there. And this is how Peterson kind of whimsically describes it. It says, "Oh yes, the people of Scree were quite free, as long as they were in their homes by midnight, and as long as they bore no weapons and they didn't complain when their fellow Screans were occasionally taken away across the sea, never to be seen again. But other than the cruel fangs and the constant threat of death and torture, there wasn't much to fear in Scree, except the stony mountains where hairy abominables crept across the land with their long teeth and hungry bellies, and across the frozen wastes, the ice prairies, where those few who made their home there battle stick buzzards daily. Further south, the plains of Palinjabje were as safe as they were beautiful, except for the rat badgers that slithered through the tall grass. A farmer from South Torboro claimed to have seen one as big as a young neep, which is about the size of a full-grown chorkney, an animal that stands about as high as a flabbit." So, how big is a rat badger?
Yes.
Right? So the reason that that sentence kind of works as a joke has a lot to do with the principles that we're going to be talking about today in the hermeneutical stuff that we'll be getting into. Human interpreters, just like human authors, are historically situated, okay? We're rooted in a particular time and place. And this is what Anthony Thistleton calls the double-sided nature of historicality. And so with this kind of critical observation that both authors and readers are historically located, there's this whole host of really significant implications that come with that, okay? And that's why what we're really studying here is the process of interpretation itself, okay? So I've kind of given an overview a couple of times. I'm not going to belabor that point too much, but basically today we went from the age of the author to the age of the text, and now we're finally arriving at the age of the reader, and we're going to camp out here for a while. We're going to spend actually 5 weeks. I thought it was going to be 4, but I had to split today's into 2 lectures, which means this is going to be a marathon. We're going to do the whole trimester, no breaks. Somebody's going to have to be holding me up here by the end, but so basically we're getting into the age of the reader, and in this session and the next, what we're going to focus on is ways that our understanding of human beings as interpreters develop. Not the author, not the text, we're talking about interpreters and what we are doing. So we're going to talk about some really basic things that have to do with our humanity, our basic, nature as human beings that really should come into play as we think about interpretation. Okay, whether it's a text, whether it's communication from another person, it doesn't really matter. But these things are just fundamental to what it means to be human, and it's a departure from the way that Descartes envisioned us. It's a departure from this sort of, like this disembodied thinking thing. It has much more to do with our history, our embodiedness, and those kinds of things that Descartes failed to account for. So we're going to talk about something called preunderstanding today, and we're going to spend most of the time on it because it's actually a really important concept to wrap our heads around as we think about good interpretation. Next time we'll talk about some related things, and then we'll get into things like our historical nature, our communal nature, our embodied nature, our emotional nature, and how all those aspects of what it means to be human play in to the act of interpretation in some important ways. And then after we address that stuff, we'll start to get into some of the things that have caused people have challenged interpretation, like postmodernism, which questions whether interpretation is even possible, meaningful interpretation, meaningful communication. And then we'll get to what's called the hermeneutic of suspicion, how that's related to postmodernism, and how it manifests in different, more recent critical disciplines. So that's kind of where we're going. All of this is focused on readers, on interpreters, what's going on when we approach any act of interpretation, okay? So for me, when I study something, it's important for me to have a grasp of like where the ideas come from. For me, how ideas emerge, you know, the figures who develop them, whether or not the ideas that I'm studying are kind of widely accepted or not, all those things kind of matter. To me, it doesn't help me to have these sort of detached ideas floating around there. I like to know how things sort of fit together. And so as I prepared this course, one of the things I tried to do is that's kind of how my hermeneutic philosophy was. I had these different ideas, these different principles out there, but I didn't really have a good sense of how they connected, what they could be traced back to. And so in preparation of this course, that's largely what I tried to do, is trace these ideas back to their original sources, so that I could know where they came from, and you guys too. So we're going to talk about some of the key figures that their ideas were very influential in what we're eventually going to get to today. Okay, that's why I'm talking about these folks. Everything that I'm going to mention here is somehow relevant. It comes into the picture later. So Schleimecker, we already talked about. So he's a key figure. In many respects, he's kind of the originator of this way of thinking about interpretation. Okay, he was the one who thought it was worth questioning, you know, not just like, what do I do to interpret, but how is interpretation even possible? A kind of meta criticism of hermeneutics, not just thinking about techniques, but actually the entire possibility and what interpretation is itself, okay? He was the one who really started to pay attention to the amount of work involved in the interpretive process, that the reader, the interpreter, has to try and put himself in the shoes of the author, try and reproduce what the author has done. That's kind of how Schleimecker understood interpretation. And he also recognized that that interpretation was as much of an art as it was a science. Okay, so to challenging the idea that it could be that there was some method you could follow or techniques that you could follow. There was a kind of analytical aspect to it. Studying language, grammar, history, that kind of stuff is kind of analytical and can be approached in a methodological way. But there were also intuitive dimensions that he recognized were necessary as well. And so it was bigger than just the process that you had to follow. There was more to it than that. And some of it didn't fall in that nice analytic sphere. So that was Schleimecker. Wilhelm Dilthey kind of carried on Schleiermacher's project. He was a student of Schleiermacher. And what he wanted was to make the human sciences kind of come to the same level as the natural sciences were. So we were in a phase of really high optimism about the natural sciences, right? We've gone through these scientific revolutions that had really made everything, had completely changed the world. And that was kind of at the top of the epistemological pyramid. Like, people really valued the kind of knowledge that came through the scientific method, the natural sciences. And so as they were studying human beings, they were hoping to get, you know, the human sciences on a similar plane through maybe similar methods. So Wilhelm Dilthey, that's what he was trying to do, but he recognized that you can't study the human sciences in the same way that you can study the natural sciences, okay? Because of the sort of historically rooted nature of human beings, you can't just reproduce history in the same way that you can reproduce natural phenomena, okay? You can't do the same kinds of experiments with humans that you can with, you know, the natural world. And so because of that, there were important differences that were kind of needed in approach for the human sciences to work. So he he also rejected Descartes' assumption that we can just start from reason and work our way out from that. Because he saw our historical existence, our very, very particular and historically rooted nature as the important starting point. You can't start in here, you have to start with history, essentially. But he was still kind of very influenced by the natural sciences, and he was looking for a kind of process you could follow. So he recognized that the process couldn't be the same, but he was looking for a method. He was looking for a technique still. And that's Gatimer criticized him kind of on that front. But anyway, he sort of introduces this idea of really elevating the human sciences as something that was worth studying in its own unique way. Okay, Edmund Husserl is someone who he took some of those ideas, but he went in a different direction. He also rejected the rationalism of Descartes as a valid starting point, and he almost takes Descartes' assumptions and inverts them. So whereas Descartes fundamentally trusted his reason and did not trust sense perception, he saw in that doubt, okay, the possibility for mistakes and stuff like that. Husserl actually is much more skeptical of things like our reason and our worldview. And he thinks what's actually the most trustworthy is just like immediate sense perception. And so he develops this whole field called Phenomenology, which is essentially trying to bracket worldviews, bracket theories of like what it means to be, theories about existence, and in particular like the subjective objective nature of what it meant to exist that had come from like Descartes and Plato and stuff. He wanted to put those things aside and just pay attention to like how the world presented itself immediately to our sense experience, to our sense perception rather, and our experience. And he wanted to try and focus on that thing and what happens there specifically. So it's a difficult concept to wrap your head around. I'll get into it a little bit more later, but that's essentially what Husserl does. So he's looking for a reliable source of understanding, but that's where he's locating it. Sense perception, the way that the world like sort of immediately and in an unfiltered way presents itself to us. Okay. After Husserl, we come to Martin Heidegger. He was an assistant at one point of Husserl's, and he kind of carried on that field of phenomenology, but with some significant departures from Husserl's way of thinking about it. Rather than bracketing the question of being and existence, Heidegger thinks that actually has to be at the center of our phenomenological project. He thought there were some critical mistakes in how we conceived of being, and that it had to be completely reconceptualized. So and with a particular emphasis on, again, time and our historical location. His most famous work is called Being and Time. He's trying to relate these two things and explore how being and time are related to one another. And he doesn't think that being can be abstracted from, again, specific temporal circumstances. Okay, we can't somehow like separate our being, our existence from the specific historical world that we kind of find ourselves in. There's no pure consciousness that's independent of temporal embodied existence. Okay, so in his criticism of Descartes, he saw Descartes' project as fundamentally missing the truth that we are always already being in the world. He's got this concept. So the German word for being is Sein, and he rejects that for this phrase he coins Dasein, which means like being there. There's no such thing as just like being by itself. All there is human being is being there, being in the world. And those things have to be held together. You can't think of being somehow extracted from our situatedness, our temporal, historical situatedness. So in some important ways, as Gatimer kind of summarizes Heidegger's thought, being is time, almost. The two are wedded. So another thing that he emphasizes is our thrownness, and what he calls thrownness, that all human beings, we find ourselves like thrown into the world. We find ourselves, we come into the world in these circumstances that we did not choose, but that influence everything about us. So it's like things like, our historical period, our family, our culture. We're thrown into that kind of way of being. Again, we don't choose it, but it's just fundamentally impacts everything about how we think about the world. Okay. Yeah. So that is my flawed attempt to summarize Heidegger. And then finally, Hans Georg Gatimer. So all the insights that I've just mentioned from these different figures, Gatimer kind of tries to take all of these and he develops his own hermeneutical project. His magnum opus is called Truth and Method, and it's probably the most significant single work for modern hermeneutics. So a lot of the stuff that Gatimer developed in his book Truth and Method is almost like just taken for granted now. So again, kind of keeping up the criticism of Descartes, he's rejecting the idea that there can be some kind of method that we follow to interpret. Interpretation, according to Gatimer, isn't about method. There's not a technique that you follow. For him, it's much more like a dialogue, okay? So starting very much from our historically situated concrete circumstances, our horizon, as he puts it, through this question and answer, through this dialogue with other people, other horizons, our horizons begin to expand. And that really is what interpretation is. He's really big on genuine questioning openness to ideas, dialogue, back and forth, and very skeptical of any concept that you can like just follow a process to arrive at correct interpretation. He just doesn't think that's how interpretation works. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this session and the next are my summary of Gatimer's, some of his best insights, okay? Okay, so that's me trying to set the groundwork a little bit. Understand that every single one of those things I just touched on is like the tiny tip of a massive and often really complex iceberg. This stuff that we're talking about in the next two lectures is actually what sucked up the most of my time in preparing this course, just trying to make heads or tails of what these guys were saying. Particularly the philosophy of Dilthey, Husserl, and Heidegger is some of the most like complex and obtuse and inaccessible that I have ever encountered. It's extremely difficult. So I just want to offer you that I am no expert on Heidegger or Husserl or their systems. This is my attempt to like have enough of a grasp of their thought so I can make sense of the hermeneutical systems that are kind of built on top of it. Okay, all of the ideas, like I said, though, all of the ideas that that I just mentioned there are relevant. They come into play, and we're going to circle back and we're going to hit a lot of those. Okay, so don't feel bad if you don't feel like you can describe Heidegger in his project. I've been reading about these guys for months and months and months, and I am very much insecure about my own understanding of them. Okay, so I've said this a bunch of times, but in all of these people, okay, we're departing very much from Descartes' rationalism, from the empiricism and that kind of stuff of the period that came before them. In many ways, the things that Descartes had tried to get away from, okay, the things that introduced doubt or misinterpretation, these guys are actually in like, okay, things like beliefs, right, worldviews, authority, tradition, experience, sense perception. Descartes was skeptical of all of that stuff. And these guys, in many respects, are reestablishing those things in different ways, but they're reestablishing those things as kind of valid sources of knowledge, valid sources of interpretation, or at the very least, bound up in the process of interpretation in a way that we can't help, we can't get away from, okay? Let me give you a couple of the terms that I'll be using, and then we can kind of break and see if there's any questions. I like to be very clear about how I'm using terminology, because one of the things that I found really frustrating as I've tried to study this stuff is people will throw these terms out and I don't know what the term means and I don't know how they're using it. And so it makes things much more difficult to understand. So just so that I'm as clear as possible on some of these concepts, here are important terms that we'll be using a lot. The first is worldview. This is something that most of us are we have a pretty good sense of what that means. Essentially, it refers to a person's entire system of belief. Okay, especially the biggest and broadest ideas about what's true about the world. and the world, like everything, okay? Everything that is the case. So that's our worldview. It's just the biggest framework in which we interpret the world. Presuppositions are things that we just assume to be true without really questioning them, certainly, and often without even being aware of them. It's just assumptions that we bring to the table that are part and parcel of our worldview, and we haven't thought about them, but they are significant in the decisions that we make when we're interpreting stuff, okay? A paradigm, okay? A paradigm is very similar to a worldview, and sometimes it's used interchangeably with the concept of worldview. But usually it's referring to something more specific. It's referring to a particular aspect of a worldview. Worldview tends to be more all-encompassing than paradigm. So, for example, we have a paradigm of how the solar system works. And that paradigm has changed over time. It's been replaced over time. So when people talk about a paradigm, the emphasis is usually on the role that a paradigm plays as a kind of interpretive grid, okay, a kind of filter through which we make sense of information, new data that we encounter. It's the filter through which we process the information we encounter in the world. So one of the people who played a big role in kind of popularizing this concept, his name is Thomas Kuhn. And he wrote this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he gives two definitions of paradigm in there. He says, on the one hand, it stands for the entire constellation of beliefs, values, techniques, and so on, shared by members of a given community, okay? On the other, it denotes one sort of element in that constellation, the concrete puzzle solutions which, employed as models or examples, can replace explicit rules as a basis for the solution of the remaining puzzles of normal science. In other words, it's a kind of model of how the world works that serves as a pattern for other comparable things. So a solar system, again, is another example, right? We believe our concept of the solar system is that it's planets revolving around a star. And so that model, that paradigm serves for how we would look at other solar systems. It's kind of a model that you follow in making sense of other data, okay? Okay, the other term, which is, these next two are the ones we're gonna be spending the most time on today. Actually, Horizon is tomorrow, or next week. But pre-understanding, okay, is a massively important concept. And the bulk of this session is on pre-understanding. It's a translation of this German word that was used by a lot of the philosophers that we just mentioned. In some respects, it combines a lot of the things I've just described, worldview, paradigm, presuppositions, okay? It's the worldview that we have inherited, the system of belief that we bring with us to an act of interpretation, okay? To new experiences, to new information. So there's a strong correspondence between what they mean by pre-understanding and the concept of presuppositions. But pre-understanding is typically less rigid than presuppositions are. It's more open to correction as we encounter new experiences, new information. It's also similar to paradigm, with the main difference being that a paradigm is usually more explicitly formulated. It's a model that we can say how the paradigm works, whereas pre-understanding, again, we're not as conscious of it. We can't articulate it in the same way. It's this set of assumptions and stuff that we just kind of carry with us. It's just the understanding that we've inherited that helps us to make sense of the world as we encounter it. So yeah, we're typically more aware of a paradigm than we are of our own pre-understanding. And pre-understanding tends to be more general than what's meant by paradigm. So the last term is horizon. And again, horizon, there's a lot of overlap in these terms, but it's most similar to worldview in that it represents the full scope of a person's perspective. A person's beliefs, paradigms, pre-understanding, and in this sense, it can be kind of used interchangeably. But the emphasis of horizon is on the limits of our understanding. Okay, if you think of a horizon is how far you can see, right? It's kind of the limits of your perspective. If you're like on the ocean, it's that boundary that bounds our sight, our vision. So it's a helpful metaphor for our kind of worldview, because it shows that we're all finite, we're all limited. We all have a horizon that we are working inside of, and that it's bounded. It also recognizes that horizons move with an interpreter. So as an interpreter, reader moves around, as we change, our horizon changes too. They can expand, right? We can have we can see further through different things. Okay, and horizon is a term that Gatimer uses a lot to talk about the way that our understanding transforms as we encounter other people, other ideas. All right. So yeah, like I said, this section and the next are largely from Gatimer's way of seeing things, his insights. So let me pause, stop. Is there anything that I've just talked about that you guys would like to talk about more? Any questions that arise, things you want clarified? So, yes, Paul.
Just a random observation. I'll keep it really quick. We're dealing with scholars, mostly in the secular world. We're looking at humanity. You know, and as a Christian, it's always a concern. How do I navigate that world of secular scholarly research on us? And you know, I can't get away from this sense that there's some value in all of what these folks are saying. Not in everything, but there's little bits and pieces. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. I think from a Christian point of view, it's the other way around. I am is an objective reality. I am because I was created, and therefore I think because of the way I was endowed by my Creator. And there is rationality, and it's important, but it's not everything.
Yeah.
Phenomenology is incredibly important. You know, I think of a human being created in the image of God as, you know, one metaphor is a piece of granite. You cannot change granite. We're all granite. Now, experience sculpts the granite into different shapes, but underneath it all, we have granite. And so, you know, experience matters, phenomenology matters, but it's not everything. We're still granite. And so, you know, trying to sort through finding what the bits and pieces are that really reflect the truth, because there is an actual truth in it. You know, and I think this is just so fascinating to go through what you're doing and how to navigate that. Just a comment.
Yeah, thank you. And everything you said is really important. None of these thinkers has the whole picture, and none of these ideas are gospel. Okay. Well, what this is an attempt to do is, and this is largely rooted in pre-understanding. Okay, I have my own pre-understanding, and it's deeply and heavily shaped by my Christian upbringing, by my Christian worldview. And so essentially from my starting point, I'm trying to engage with these different ideas out there and find out, how do these help? How do these help me be a better interpreter? Are there insights that that strike me as true here that will help us just understand this process better? And I think a lot of times what happens is, as we encounter these concepts, and often they're expressed from a sort of secular perspective, but you can see how, like, oh, this actually meshes really well with this sort of Christian principle that I have. And actually it sheds new light on how I can think about this. And I'm hoping that that's largely what this project ends up being. You know, as we kind of bring this whole thing to its conclusion at the end, I'm hoping that it will be more clear how these things fit together. Have any of you guys been doing the 1 Corinthians 13 exercises? I just kind of included them in emails, but essentially what I'm doing is sort of following what we talk about week by week, exploring the different things we've talked about as applied to reading 1 Corinthians 13. And that actually, I think, helps in a way that I don't do in the lecture, show how some of these concepts overlap and how they come together. But yes, thank you for that perspective. Any other, Christian?
A culturally in vogue term right now is the term implicit bias.
Yeah.
Is that the same thing as presupposition?
It's I don't think it quite is. There's overlap, and there are also subtle things, like there's a Venn diagram there. But I would say that implicit bias, honestly, it's more, I would say it's more related to pre-understanding than it is to presuppositions. It's largely kind of, the bias that we have is largely connected to our experience. We have a certain experience of the world. It's different from the experience of other people. And sometimes when we encounter other people, we don't see things the same way. And we assume, because it's our experience, that things are different than what they say. So there's kind of just, by virtue of being historically situated, we all have a kind of bias that you overcome, and we'll get to this in more detail. I mean, or at least related, but you overcome that in large part through this process of dialogue, of fusion of horizons, of trying to have as many conversations, as many experiences as possible, so that our pre-understanding expands to include the experiences of others that we haven't personally had. But yeah, so, and eventually I talk about, so the hermeneutical error that we'll be talking about, actually at the end of next week, is confirmation bias, which again also has some overlap there. It's just, we'll get to that though. So I don't want to try and cover that ground here. Okay, so for now, is that good? Marcel, you had?
Yeah. Would you say that a lot of what these guys are doing is kind of a pushback against the scientism and naturalism that was taking over the academy at the time?
Yeah, big time. Starting with Schleimecker, like he's heavily influenced by Romanticism, which basically looks at the rationalism, the empiricism, and says like, that's not a full, picture of what it means to be human. You're missing a lot in that paradigm, that sort of, and yes, the elevation of that kind of scientism or whatever as the penultimate way of knowing the world. Yes, they're saying it's not that simple. And so yes, this entire project largely is a pushback against that and a lot of those assumptions. And for Gatimer, he criticizes some of the people that came before him that are pushing back, but he says you're not pushing back enough. You still have this assumption that's rooted in that kind of rationalism or empiricism or whatever. So yes, is the short answer. All right. All right. So pre-understanding. Let's jump into this. So I've kind of broken pre-understanding down into these different components. All right. We're going to talk about its inevitability. Right? We can't get away from pre-understanding. How it provides us with a necessary point of contact or common ground with other people, with the world. We're going to talk about phenomenology again and how that helps understand the way that our pre-understanding is shaped. And then maybe the intuitive dimension of it, but at this point I'm skeptical we'll get to that piece. So I mentioned how Thistleton noted the double-sided nature of historicality. Authors are shaped by their historical situatedness, so are interpreters, so are readers. We are shaped by our time and place, just like authors are. Okay, we bring with us a host of assumptions, paradigms, experiences, as well as a language, right? To every act of interpretation. None of us fell from the sky, and none of us can set those things fully aside. We can't, push them aside to become these totally objective, neutral interpreters. That's just not possible. We cannot get away from our historicality and all that it brings with it. It is inevitable. It's part and parcel of what it means to be human. So while people in the Enlightenment tradition distrusted those things, and sometimes with good reason, okay, hermeneutical thinkers like Gatimer in particular recognize that all of that stuff, even though it's fraught with misinterpretation, is what makes understanding possible. It's what makes interpretation possible. There is no interpretation apart from our pre-understanding. It gives us a framework, it gives us a point of contact from which and through which we're able to interpret the world. I mentioned briefly before that for Gatimer, interpretation and understanding occur when there's what they refer to as a fusion of horizons. And we'll get to this more next time. But essentially, it's when our horizon encounters another horizon, a text, person, etc. And through a process, which again, we'll get into in more detail, but through a process of engagement there, of dialogue there, the horizons fuse. And our horizon expands by virtue of what is provided by this experience with the other horizon that we've encountered, that we've fused with, okay? So it brings us back to that joke, Andrew Peterson's paragraph that I read at the beginning. The fusion of horizons that we're talking about, it presupposes and requires a shared area of common perspectives, concepts, or even judgments. But he says, so in order to understand something new, okay, in order to understand a rat badger, I already have to understand things that I can connect the rat badger to. I have to have an existing understanding through which I can make sense of this new idea, this new concept, okay? So that provides us with a dilemma. And Thistleton says, if understanding presupposes understanding, how can it begin, okay? Where's our starting point? If I have to connect new experiences, new ideas to something, like yeah, maybe I have this set of experience right now that I can connect it to, but where did that start, right? There has to be a starting point, and there's a kind of paradox there almost. So he says that Schleimecker was one of the first major thinkers to really wrestle with that paradox, that what is to be understood must in some sense be already known. So he notes that there's an obvious circularity there, right? There's a kind of circle that we're trapped in. But he says that it's also true to the facts of everyday experience. Like we're not just making sense of something from this detached, unconnected place. Like all of us are rooted somewhere. There's an understanding that we're connecting every new data point to. Schleimecker said, every child arrives at the meaning of a word only through hermeneutics. But that word, okay, will remain meaningless if the child can't somehow connect it to what they already know. In a similar way, Michael Polanyi, scientist, kind of philosopher, says, in learning to speak, every child accepts a culture constructed on the premises of the traditional interpretation of the universe, rooted in the idiom of the group to which it was born. And every intellectual effort of the educated mind will be made within this frame of reference. So, well, and then one more thing, and then I'll summarize these. There's a philosopher, Wittgenstein, who says it more simply than anybody. He just says, every human being has parents. So as children learn words, what words mean, it's all done in the frame of reference that they inherit. They've inherited a family, a culture, a language, and when they encounter a word, it's already in that context of all those other things, okay? So again, you can't separate the child's understanding of the word from that historically situated experience. It's all connected, and that's actually necessary. So that concept, this pre-existent set of understandings, is what the concept of pre-understanding is trying to communicate. And I'm gonna get, this is gonna get repetitive, but interpretation is not possible apart from that existing set of understanding, that existing set of assumptions. Okay. So one of the major concepts in hermeneutics that we're going to get to in depth at the end of the course is what's called the Hermeneutical Circle or the Hermeneutical Spiral. It's an idea that, like, for instance, you can, if you're talking about a text, there are many different ways that the Hermeneutical Circle or Spiral can be understood. But if you're talking about a text, a text is a whole thing. It's a unit, and it's composed of parts. And you can only understand the parts in light of the whole, but you can also only understand the whole in light of the parts. So there's a spiraling circular process that we have to go through to connect those two things. How do the parts and the whole connect to one another? And you kind of just have to start somewhere. Okay, so the Hermeneutical Spiral is this process we go through of figuring out how those two things fit together. Similarly, I have a particular worldview. Okay, and so as I encounter new information in the world, my worldview, like that, I make sense of that new information in light of my worldview, in light of my pre-understanding. Okay, then essentially, after I make sense of that, I come back around and I try and say, is there something about my worldview? Is there something about my paradigm that I need to adjust somehow in light of this new information that I've learned? Okay, so there's a circular spiraling process there as well. Our worldview is how we make sense of stuff, but stuff informs our worldview, and around the spiral we go. Ideally, we're moving towards something, right? Positive. So that's what the hermeneutical spiral kind of is. And essentially what pre-understanding is the necessary starting point for that spiral. Okay, so these hermeneutical thinkers will say that understanding can only be achieved by following that kind of a process, by going around and around and around in that kind of spiraling way. But for that process to even begin, you have to have somewhere to start. And pre-understanding is that necessary starting point.
Hey, Dom,
Yeah.
would you say that the spiral, the goal is it's spiraling in towards understanding?
That's the
As
goal.
opposed to a circle where you're just never getting anywhere?
Right. So like Heidegger says, it's not a vicious circle. Like that's where the idea, that's why they changed, because it originally was Hermeneutical Circle, right? That's how Schleimecker talks about it. But as people thought about it more, they said, well, ideally it's a spiral where we're actually moving towards something, towards truth, ideally, right? It's also provisional there. Like there's also a recognition that you do keep going around it. And as finite human beings, you never arrive at like, oh, boom, I've got it all figured out, right? So Gatimer writes in Truth and Method, he says, history does not belong to us, but we belong to it. Long before we understand ourselves through the process of self-examination, we understand ourselves in a self-evident way in the family, society, and state in which we live. So by the time that we're aware, okay, by the time that we're thinking about ourselves, by the time that we're thinking about the world, we are not blank slates. Critical point, we are not brains on a stick. It's inevitable that we've inherited a pre-understanding from our family of origin and from experiences that precede our consciousness, okay? That's just a necessary fact of life. It's a necessary fact of what it means to be human. And like I said, it will bring with it misunderstanding. My experience, my worldview is limited. I have things that I don't know. I have things that I misunderstand. But even though it introduces that, and even though it doesn't give me the kind of certainty that Descartes wanted, what it does do is give me a starting point through which I can access the world. And those two things are held in tension, okay? There are things that about my pre-understanding, at least the misinterpretation, but it's also what makes proper interpretation possible. Okay.
So I'm just trying, it's okay, right?
Yeah.
So I think I'm just trying to connect this even just to, as we approach the Bible, but wherever we start, we all start reading the Bible somewhere with our experiences, with our understanding. And
Yes.
So I'm trying to, so then and the Bible is made up of many parts of all these different books and all these different authors. And
Yes.
so you look at it and you read, the way you get to know the Bible is just by doing one after another, and you're reading different pieces and interacting. And so it's like connecting all those pieces to the whole. And yeah, you're just like, as you do that, you have a better understanding of the whole, and it interacts with you and your experiences and your understanding. So is that, I don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the model that we're after, right? When you pick up one of Paul's letters, your first time through, you got no sense of where he's going. There's a very, very, very provisional understanding that gives you a sense of what the whole might be. And that expands as you start to put the pieces and parts together. But really, it's only when you get a sense of the whole that you begin to be able to say that you've got some kind of grasp on it. Because then once you've got the big picture, then you can start to connect. Okay, now I can go back and I see how this smaller verse or part connects to that bigger overarching picture. That's where real understanding starts to come from. But again, you can only go through that with a process. And all of us are going to have a starting point, a set of assumptions that we have about Paul, some of which will be wrong. So like, I don't have time to get into it, but I mean, there's ways that you can trace how like biblical studies has advanced in our understanding of like Paul's worldview. And there are subtle differences between like things that Luther assumed and stuff like that help us to have a better sense of like what he was actually doing when he was engaging with the Pharisees and Pharisaical thought and stuff like that. So there's this just constant process of continuing to read and revision based on the details that we learn. So yes, it's very much related to our reading of the Bible. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the necessary common ground, the point of contact. And let's go back to the rat badger illustration from the beginning, okay? that illustration shows how it shows the importance of pre-understanding both from a positive and a negative angle. That's why it's kind of a joke. From the negative side, we've already mentioned how the joke points to a need for a point of contact, okay? For understanding to take place, there has to be a shared area of common perspectives or concepts. So to learn about a rat badger, we need to know something about what a meep is. To learn what a meep is, we need to know something about chorkneys. To learn what a chorkney is, we need to know something about flabbits. And if we don't know anything about flabbits, we have a problem, because there's no frame of reference through which we can follow that chain, okay? There was a minimal level of pre-understanding of flabbits required for the rest of Peterson's description of rat badgers to make sense, okay? He can keep describing them all the way down, but we don't live on air, we are, and so we won't be able to figure out just how big a rat badger is if he just keeps referencing things that we don't have a frame of reference for, okay? Yeah. Yeah, let me, yes, I'm gonna reread it actually just a second here. Okay, so that's the negative point. At least you can, so he describes a rat badger by referencing all these things that we also don't know what they are. So it just keeps on going, and we're like, that doesn't help me because I don't have anywhere to fit that. So it's a joke because we recognize that. We recognize that we can't make sense of his description because we don't have the frame of reference. But we actually do share some common ground. And the joke wouldn't work in another way if we didn't have that common shared frame of reference, okay? And that brings us to the positive angle. So yeah, let me read the paragraph again. He said, further south, the plains of Pale and Jabjay were as safe as they were beautiful, except for the rat badgers that slithered through the tall grass. A farmer from South Torboro claimed to have seen one as big as a young meep, which is about the size of a full-grown chorkney, an animal that stands about as high as a flabbit, okay? So on one hand, the lack of common ground with his descriptions is why it works as a joke, okay? If the last animal had been kitten, then it'd be like, oh, that's just a description. It's not a joke because he's just describing it and that's how he's going, right? But we do share some common ground with him, or it wouldn't work as a joke in a different way, right? If he had written that in Ugaritic, none of us would be able to understand anything. We wouldn't know it was a joke. So there's actually a lot of shared common ground that we have. So we understand enough about what he's communicating to know that it is a joke, okay? Because if there was no common ground, we wouldn't understand anything he was saying at all. And similarly, we actually can get in the ballpark at least of what he's talking about. The ballpark of how big a rat badger is. We know that it isn't the size of a planet or the size of a microbe. Because in addition to sharing the common ground of the English language, which he's using, we also have the concept of plains, farmers, grass, animals contained within our pre-understanding. Okay, we bring all those concepts to our reading of his paragraph. And so there is a point of contact that we have. So we can get close. We just can't get precise with him, okay? So again, it's that pre-understanding that makes interpretation possible. His joke depends both on the pre-understanding that we do have and the pre-understanding that we don't have. Okay, does that make sense? So Thistleton quotes this guy, John Macquarie. He says, we could never enter into any understanding of a text unless there were at least some minimum of common ground between ourselves and the text. If it did not link up at any point with our experience, we could make nothing of it, okay? This link is a matter of the interpreter's pre-understanding. He already has certain categories of understanding under which the meaning of a text can be grasped, and these constitute the pre-understanding which he brings to the text. Okay, so this is why it can be so difficult to answer questions that some children ask. Like if you have a very perceptive and intuitive pre-adolescent child who asks lots of questions, as we do, and they begin asking questions whose answer only makes sense if you understand something of like sexual desire, very difficult to answer those questions, okay? To make a baby, or because they love each other very much, don't actually get at why people do certain things. It's just not that simple. But for a child who they haven't grown into the experience of like sexual desire, then there's no frame of reference that they have that you can help them understand. So they see things, they see people doing things in the world that just don't make sense because they don't have that pre-understanding yet. It limits their ability to interpret what's going on around them because of that. This other guy talks about, love, right? Is it not vain to speak of love to one who has not known love, or the joys of learning to those who reject it? One must already have in some measure knowledge of the matter being discussed. This may be termed the minimal pre-knowledge necessary for understanding, without which one cannot leap into the hermeneutical circle. Okay. I have to make some cuts here. All right, so I do want to talk about phenomenology and the way that it influences our understanding of how pre-understanding comes about. So the way that I understand phenomenology is that rather than these theories of existence, subject-object, this analytical way of approaching the world, it locates meaning in how we actually experience and encounter the world. So there's a famous example of a hammer, okay? Our understanding of what a hammer means doesn't come to us in a dictionary definition kind of way. We first experience a hammer when we grasp it and we pound in a nail. We almost indwell the hammer. It becomes an extension of ourself almost. Like when we're pounding in a nail, we're not thinking about the hammer as a piece of metal in our hand. We're focusing on the nail, and that hammer is like an extension of ourselves almost. And it's that indwelling, it's that experiential participatory engagement with the thing that provides us with our initial understanding of what it means, its significance. So it's trying to take that sense perception, that experiential encounter with things seriously as how things become imbued with meaning for us. Okay. So this is a book that after I studied this, I was like, oh, she's doing essentially phenomenology. There's this book, A Whole is to Did. Okay. And look at how it's written for kids. It's a book of first definitions. Well, look at how she describes stuff. Okay. A whole is to did. Here's some other things. A door is to open. A door is to shut. Steps are to sit on, right? A hole is to look through. A hole is when you step in it and you go down. So is the best way to describe a hole really a definition like, dictionary definition, a hollow place in a solid body or mass, a cavity, for example, a hole in the ground. If you explain a hole to a kid like that, you're going to get a blank stare back, okay? That's not how kids experience or encounter the world. They encounter the world like that, okay? So little stones are for little children to gather up and put in little piles, okay? A brother is to help you. The principal is to take out splinters. Okay, and there are other examples here. Mashed potatoes are to give everybody enough. So that, in a very simple way, I think is a good illustration of what phenomenology is, right? It's that experiential dimension that these things all, we encounter them, our pre-understanding develops by virtue of encountering things in that form. All right. So I'm going to go fast because we have like 3 minutes. Let me try and land this, okay? I've heard lots of pastors and professors talk about the significance of the metaphor of God as a father, okay? If our understanding of father is just this dictionary definition, then it doesn't present us with any real problems, but it also doesn't connect us emotionally to what a father means, what it means for God to be father, right? So having experiences with fathers gives us a point of contact through which we can make sense of that metaphor, through which we can make sense of how God is described in the Bible, okay? So it's something necessary. It's the only way we can make sense of it. At the same time, it also has tremendous potential to distort our understanding, to distort our interpretation. Because if we've had bad experiences with a father, what that means for us is shaped by that, right? We carry with us a whole bunch of pre-understanding about what a father is Some of it is good and helpful. Some of it is not, as far as understanding God. And so that's why pre-understanding, when it comes to, again, interpreting something as basic as that biblical metaphor, it's helpful and it has potential for good, it has potential for harm, it has potential for interpretation and misinterpretation. And that point is one of the most important reasons why one of the most important reasons to grasp the concept of pre-understanding, okay? What it does for us and what it does, how it works for us and how it works against us. Again, to quote Wittgenstein, every human being has parents. None of us comes to the Bible as blank slates. Okay, our pre-understanding is what makes interpretation possible, and it also creates significant potential for misunderstanding at the same time. I can't get to the intuition projection stuff. Basically, we're always projecting onto a text that we encounter. I'm sorry about that. Let me just try and make these last 2 points that I wanted to get out before we close. I think Thistleton makes a good point here, how the significance of all of this. He says, the interpreter must endeavor to become aware of the nature of prejudgments and pre-understanding which he brings to the text. This must inevitably come, he must inevitably come to the text with anticipatory ideas, but it is part of the hermeneutical task to make these conscious, to be aware of what we're bringing to the text, to make these conscious in order to assess them against the text itself. Once again, this assessment will never be a once for all definitive act, as if one could fully separate one's pre-understanding from his subsequent understanding of the text, but it is a part of a process that must be begun. Awareness of what we are as interpreters, what makes it possible for us and what works against us is really important if we're going to interpret well. Yeah, so I'm going to leave it there. There's that balance. I hope that one of the consequences of this is that it generates a kind of humility, both for our limited capacity to interpret, the limitations that we have as human beings when we interpret text, and also the humility in the sense of other people, recognizing that like other people, they interpret and maybe they misinterpret, but there are reasons for that, okay? It's not because they're evil. It's not because of, I mean, some people are, but like there's lots of reasons why we come to text and arrive at different interpretations. And if we understand what makes us human and what goes into the act of interpretation, hopefully we can have a little bit more understanding and be a little bit more willing to listen when other people differ from us, okay? Because there may be something to learn. So I'm going to end there because we're now a minute over time. Does somebody just mind closing us in prayer just to close this out really quickly? Please.
Father, I want to thank you for this morning. Thank you for this opportunity to gather. And thank you for Dom and all the work he's put into this. Lord, I do ask that this would begin to sink in, begin to affect and change us and change how we think and how we look at things. And that the main thing we would come away with is this love for one another and understanding for one another as we interact. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, guys.